Well, how the heck do we structure a synthesis paper? What kind of order do we put stuff in? What do we even put in this paper? And how do we make an outline? And this video lesson is going to try to help you with those things. Although, let me tell you, this is a paper where you have to make some structural and organizational choices yourself because everybody's topics will be so different and you need to do what works for your paper. That's the general overall guideline. You need to do what works for your paper. Remember, first of all, this is a synthesis paper. By now, we know what that means. Synthesis means that you're going to have multiple perspectives and voices within your paper. You are not just pulling in a source to use one quote and then you never hear from them again. You need to be thorough in the way that you deal with sources. You want to acknowledge their overall arguments. You want to add in sources that disagree with you and talk about what good points they're making. And one key thing I'm looking for is some paragraphs will have more than one source within them, and you are allowing those sources to interact with each other. Some paragraphs will have more than one source within them, and you are allowing those sources to interact with each other. I said it twice because it's really important. So, reminders on a synthesis paper and some things you want to keep in mind as you're forming your outline. You're integrating information from multiple sources and using these to support an assertion, your assertion, the assertion that you have formulated. So you are still taking a position, but these ideas are elaborating on, supporting, and discussing the position that you're taking. You are going to attempt to represent multiple perspectives because your goal is to give the reader a complex understanding of the topic. That is the most important goal in a synthesis paper, is to allow that conversation to occur so that your reader has a more complex perspective after they've read your paper. You are going to, as you incorporate these multiple sources, you're going to use linking devices, transitions, what I call synthesis connectors. So you're going to talk about the ways in which the sources interact with each other. A good synthesis paper is also going to justify its own importance. So you need to make it clear why the conversation that you're having matters. Think about adding to your paper some discussion of why it's so important that we talk about these things. Why do they matter? You are not only going to quote, you will also paraphrase from sources. So that's another marker of complex source usage that we're looking for, mature source usage. Sometimes you will include quotations, but sometimes you will use a cited paraphrase. Sometimes you will summarize a source within this paper. So we've learned about paraphrasing, summarizing, and quoting, and I do want to see all three of those moves occurring within this paper. And as I read this paper, I should get a sense, wow, they've really thought a lot about this and they know what they're talking about, right? And so that requires reading several sources, using several sources, and depth of thought, really looking for depth of thought about a narrow topic related to the overall topic. So with that in mind, there's two main approaches that you can take here. The first one is you're mainly responding to a source. So maybe you want to formulate your paper as a response to Dershowitz. So you will still incorporate other sources that help you have other discussions in other paragraphs, but mainly you're going to talk about something you want to point out about Dershowitz's argument. If this is your move, you may even mention Dershowitz very early on in the paper. You're going to spend a significant amount of time summarizing Dershowitz, like a paragraph of summary, before you start to point out what you want to point out about his argument. So you're going to have a slightly different approach to your structure and your outline if that's your main thing. Most people, though, do number two option here. You will be using sources to introduce important considerations and evidence, but your position sort of arises from your own experience or perspective, and then you're going to pull in Dershowitz anyway. Every paper will use Dershowitz in addition to a couple other sources from the source bank. So regardless of whether you use that as your main source or just a source, that's up to you. So before we get there, I want to make sure that you have seen the synthesis paper structure guidelines document because that's important too. And this is really essential. These are guidelines rather than rules. So you don't have to go in this order. You might have two paragraphs of number two. You might have the counterclaim very early in the paper, depending on the type of thesis that you have. So you may do some of this here, and then it comes back and you do it again later in the paper. You may also decide to not do this part because it doesn't apply to your paper. These are just guidelines to get you started, to give you some ways of thinking about structuring this paper. So over on the left, you'll see if your position is mainly built around response to a main source. So we'll talk about that first. If you're mainly responding to Dershowitz, and that is the key thing you're doing in your paper, either way, right, either one of these, you're going to have an introduction ending in a thesis that makes it clear what issue you're talking about. And remember, philosophical, practical, and poetic introductions, everything we learned about introductions for the previous papers still applies here. So we're not going to talk in depth about what the introduction should look like. But if you are mainly responding to a key text, for example, Dershowitz, you would talk about Dershowitz in that intro. You need to introduce us to what he said before you even give your thesis, probably, right, in most cases. You will, very early in the paper, summarize that main source that you're responding to, probably in a paragraph, right? So you might have a whole paragraph of summary. Then you're going to focus in on the key thing they said that you are responding to. So you'll probably discuss a main point of the source, your critique, but then you won't just end there. You'll go into more detail on your own side of the position. Now notice further reasons to support your perspective. This doesn't mean you're going to put multiple reasons in one paragraph. It just means move for you probably would do next, maybe in multiple paragraphs. So one reason per paragraph probably. So if you have 2 reasons to support your perspective, you would have 2 paragraphs with one of those in each paragraph. Right? Oh, maybe there's an opposing perspective that you want to add here, or another important consideration that you want to add here. If you're identifying a problem, perhaps you want to have a solution or talk about what needs to happen next. And then conclusions do the same thing all the time. Think of the conclusion as your opportunity to make it clear to your readers who you're talking to and what you want. Audience and purpose, right? In the conclusion, audience and purpose should come through really strongly. What do you want to happen? You could have a call to action. You could have a suggestion. Or a sense of why it's important. Like, if we want a true equity in education, we must blah, 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 right? So this is the main structure your paper is going to have, or might have, or that you can work off of if you're mainly responding to a key source. Agreeing or disagreeing, applying that source in a different way, pointing out something that source is overlooking. You might want to use this as a starting place. If you are paving your own road for your thesis statement here, and you are going to incorporate Dershowitz and some other sources, but you're taking a position of your own invention. You're going to have an introduction. It's going to make the issue apparent. You probably, in the intro, are going to point out what some people say about it in a very brief way. In other words, what's the state of the debate so far? What's the state of the discussion so far? And then what do you say about that discussion? If you've pointed out an issue or a problem, causes would probably come next. Causes tend to come very early in papers, or the history of the issue, or why the issue exists. Again, you're going to incorporate some sources as you have that discussion. Discussion of a reason to support your position, like why is this important? This could maybe be effects that make it significant, make it important, and you're probably going to pull in some key sources here as well. I have a reminder here, briefly summarize any sources you use. Anytime you pull in a source, we need maybe a 1-sentence or more summary of that source overall to give the reader some context before you just plop in a quote. Especially in a synthesis paper, you want to be really thorough with how you discuss the sources. Further discussion, you could call in other perspectives, other reasons, other effects, other groups of people, whatever. You probably also will have some sort of counterclaim or differing perspectives. Again, sometimes this occurs a little earlier in the paper than here. So you're going to mix and match, move these around in a way that makes sense, double some of them, do multiple paragraphs of some of them. Again, here, if you've identified a problem, you probably want to make some suggestions as to what we should do about that. And then again, in the conclusion, your reader should really have an understanding of what you want and who you're talking to. Who should be doing something about this? Maybe students need to change their perspective. Maybe parents need to do something differently, right? So here's what I recommend. You can, depending on how valuable you feel this is to you, whether you need this type of support or not, you could take this and copy it and paste it, and then use these columns to sort of help you fill in your outline, and that's perfectly valid. But I am looking for a detailed outline on this. So on your process doc at this point, you should have your brainstorming complete. You should have your topic and thesis. Your thesis draft should be there. It should be clear what it is, where it's labeled. And then you want to have a detailed outline. So a detailed outline is going to have the main idea of each paragraph as a phrase or a sentence, and then details and sources noted underneath in bullet points. Please note, you should not have paragraphs on your outline. I want to see your structure, and it's easier for me to see your structure if you have not written whole paragraphs yet. So please don't give me a paragraph. I want to see structure, and that means bullet points. I'm looking for bullet points. Here's an example of what that might look like. So this is a student sample process doc. They did their brainstorming here. They filled in their topic, their focus, and their key points. Look how detailed this is, really nice. Here's their tentative thesis. So definitely pause, take a look at that tentative thesis so you can see what they're talking about. They filled in their source chart as well, which you should have done at this point too. Here are the key sources they're using. Now please note, they also needed to include what is college for. They did not include that there, and they should have. And then, because that will allow you to think about how you can incorporate Dershowitz into your argument. So that's one thing that this could have done better. But they have here, like, what about this source is relevant to my discussion? So this is really helpful. Here's what a detailed outline looks like. Number one, intro. Okay, so this is going to be my intro. And then they have two key things they want to include. Here's the thesis. So they've reminded themselves to include the thesis here. Summarize the debate, show a trend. They're going to do a practical style of intro. The second thing they're going to talk about is why education is a human right. So they have included the source that they're going to use to help them have that discussion. Here is the key, sort of the topic sentence that they're going to start the paragraph with. Here, and here's the two key things they're going to include. So details, plural, meaning more than one thing should be in some of these. How it's being kept away from lower class America. Here is their topic sentence. Here are the key points they're going to make in this paragraph. Here's the topic of paragraph 4. Here's their topic sentence. Here are their key points. So it doesn't have to look exactly like this, but notice the details, and that's what I'm looking for, a detailed outline. That means you're going to have the topic of your paragraph identified. You may or may not have a topic sentence. I think it would be really helpful to include that, but you don't have to. And then the key points they're going to make, including sometimes the source. So they could just put Mitchell underneath as one of these things that they're going to incorporate into their outline. So this is what I'm looking for as I'm looking at your process doc. Please do let me know if you have any questions, but remember, the outline that you put here, excuse me, you will get feedback on when you turn in your process doc. So leave your questions on your outline, and I'll be happy to take a look at those when you turn it in. Good luck.